Hello, hello. I am so excited to be recording another one of these. I don't even know what we're calling it. I guess we're just going to call it the Inside Job podcast with Philip Cox or something of that variety. I did this on a whim only a couple weeks ago, and the response when I did a video of me reading, I have friends that wanted to support and wanted to read, but they said, we don't really like reading. And I said, well, what if I read it for you? And that seemed to be the go for some people. And so the response, I didn't know what was going to happen, but sometimes you just try something, and I tried it, and it wasn't terrible. They said it wasn't terrible, and that is pretty good if you ask me. So I'm happy with that. And so we're going to go round two. And this is part two in the returning to the act of ritual. You know how everybody loves these Old Testament terms like ritual. It just gets everybody going. Of course it doesn't. But we are going to reclaim this ancient idea, these ancient wise ideas around ritual. So, returning to the act of ritual, part two. And today's is called Welcome One, Welcome All. A few years back, if Susan and I found ourselves in the midst of a difficult conversation, to ease the tension, we started using an inside joke saying, "Hey, it's okay. I forgive you for not being exactly like me." Though the joke has fallen out of regular circulation, if either of us used it again today, we would both giggle, and we have been giggling since I've brought it back into the mix with the writing of this post. And it's a silly little phrase, and it's so on the nose that it can be rejected immediately. The idea that she needs forgiveness for not being me is ridiculous. Of course it is. But the fact is that so often the reason I find myself all huffy and puffy with someone else is because they have the audacity, the nerve, to be doing something other than what I want them to be doing. And wow, does that get on my nerves. And it does. And then just under that paragraph, I've got this little box that says subscribe. And if you haven't subscribed to the Substack, you certainly are invited to do so. But then it goes on. I usually experience this feeling at home when we're entering round 6 of wrangling kids into their rooms for the night, which we did tonight, and I'm happy to report to you that I failed miserably at ritualizing that. I just did an awful job. But round 6 of us putting those kids into bed, or Sue's not properly celebrating me when I've folded those socks after she's only asked me 4 or 5 times. Of course, the most obvious example is the everyday road rage that creeps up on even the best of us. Hey, you, get out of that lane! Speed up! Slow down! What are you thinking? Can't you see we're trying to get somewhere here? My wife lovingly says to me as I drive our beautiful family to the park. Surely we're not alone. Just when we're trying to ritualize each moment and be present to the gift of life and see our tasks as sacred, some blockhead just won't live up to the wonderful ideals that we have in store for them. Obviously, standing outside of these experiences, writing this here, you listening to it there, most of us would agree that all of this is a bit silly. But in the moment of frustration, all of our best efforts and wonderful inner stillness can so quickly go to, and I use the word poo here, and I'm using the word poo on this podcast because I don't want one of those little, the little E's next to this podcast. So I'm going to use the word poo. All our good intentions go to poo. So why does this happen? Great question. And what can we do to keep these moments from robbing our sense of joy and peace? Even better question. Is there a way that we can ritualize these events and use them as a way to grow rather than them getting us stuck? Maybe the best question. Because offense, that's what we're talking about. Offense is one, not a fence, but offense is one of the quickest ways we can get stuck in our spiritual growth. I often say that offense is like quicksand to the soul. Jesus, in the brilliant prayer that he teaches his students, says, speaking about God, your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, he's saying, God, we want your way of doing things to come and replace our way of doing things. Now, why do I bring up this particular prayer? Because offense and anger and offense is an emotional reaction that occurs anytime that our kingdom isn't coming and our will isn't being done. When someone else's kingdom starts encroaching onto our kingdom in this kingdom on kingdom bumper car blast. As a first instinct, this reaction makes complete and total sense. We prioritize our ideas and our feelings and our beliefs about the world because it's these distinctions that help us make sense of the world. And you can see last post where I describe that in detail. These distinctions help give us an identity, a sense of self that stands outside of everyone else. This process in human growth is what developmental psychologists call individuation. It begins in our earliest stages as infants and is incredibly important in healthy development. In short, what it's doing is it's helping us to know where mom ends and where we begin. Over time, it helps us discover and define what values and beliefs we hold and which ones we reject, and all of that. It is a good and a much needed process. However, as we move out of these early stages of life and early stages of consciousness and into adulthood, if we're not careful, we can begin to form strong walls, impenetrable walls out of these points of distinction, and our ideals and preferences turn into capital T truths. Not a truth, but the truth on those matters. This can narrow our vision to where our perspective is the only way we're willing to see the world. And when we discover and when we encounter someone or something that calls one of our wonderful ideals into question, one of our beliefs into question, now, because we've built an identity out of that wall, out of that thought, out of that idea, it's built so high and so thick to protect us and to keep them out. When something calls one of those ideals into question, those beliefs into question, we feel wounded, angry, betrayed, fearful. So, what do? We quickly go back to reinforce the wall, reinforce our ego structures by going into this us versus them, this good versus evil stance. We turn them into a villain, and so that we can say that I'm on the right side, you're on the wrong side, and we get ready for this battle. That's what's happening on deep inside. If we're religious or faith-oriented people in particular, this can be really dangerous and tricky because we can even get God, the one who spins out stars and an entire universe, we get him in on our little bickering and fighting too. And have you ever noticed that he's always on our side, of course? Again, these instincts aren't wrong or bad. They develop for our survival. So it's not a question of are these bad, but are we being invited to something more depth, more heart, more connection, more complexity, and a deeper sense of oneness with all things, even when we disagree with those things and when those things forget to fold the socks? Could we for a moment set aside some of our assumptions and our preferences and begin to explore, maybe even with a bit of grace and understanding, whether they too just might have a good reason for doing what they just did, and whether they too might also have a unique and perhaps even equal perspective on the issue? As I sit here in the old corner shop writing these words, or in my office as I'm recording these words, if I was to describe this cafe, I'd say something like, the sunlight drifts in, inching its way around the white letters of a hand-painted sign reading the old corner shop, and it's prominently displayed in a large bay window, and the light dances across the espresso machine and flickers, catching my eye. But from where I sit, I don't realize that there's also a lovely blue door that hangs directly in front of me, because my sight of it is obscured by the large "I'd tamp that" t-shirt hanging on a shelf that's suspended by rope from the ceiling. However, if I was to shuffle to the left a bit, the blue door would come into view. Or if I were to move to another seat, one facing the opposite direction, both the window and the tamping t-shirt would disappear. Then my description would include something about a bookcase and a bright yellow couch and an Audrey Hepburn in painted form that's presiding over the cafe from her framed perch on the wall. Both descriptions are different. Both descriptions are accurate. The difference? Of course, we all know perspective. Now, it's easy enough to understand perspective when we're sitting in a cafe in two different seats and looking at two different things. That's easy. That's obvious. But what if we were to bring the same level of understanding to other drivers, to our partners, our parents, and to the people on the other side of that damn Twitter account? I wish they'd stop posting because it's really getting on my nerves. Actually, they should keep posting. It's good for me. That's what this is all about. What if we could live remembering that while we see the world from a particular set of ideals, beliefs, values, and preferences, no matter how wonderful they are, we are only seeing one slice of a much larger whole. One of the greatest gifts that I find in working with the Enneagram, and we're going to have to do a series on that. I can't talk about that now because it would go too long. So we'll do a whole series on that at some point, but it's talking about personality and motives and what's driving our behavior deep down. That's what it's about, and it's really cool. But anyway, one of the greatest gifts I find in working with the Enneagram is its constant reminder that however clear my vision appears to be on an issue, I'm ever only seeing at minimum 1/9 of the picture. There is always another way to see whatever I'm looking at, and God alone, and this does mean God alone, has the aperture, the framework, the ability to see the whole thing. Now, it's important to say that we are talking about offenses, these little preferences and perspective shifts. What we're not talking about are big issues of forgiveness and big issue of injustice, deep wounds and trauma and betrayal, and things that can take much deeper healing and months and even professional help to work through. That is a different category than what we're talking about, and we'll come back and talk about forgiveness at some point. But this is talking about those small irritations, the daily offenses that get us stuck in these feedback loops of frustration that end up stealing our ability to live with the crisp, clean air of joy and freedom. Freedom and joy with ourselves and with the world around us. Living easily offended causes so many little crusties, these little hard bits that begin to grow in and around our hearts and our minds. Offense and unforgiveness are toxic, and they can arrest the development of our spiritual lives. So, how do we take these moments of offense from a trap and turn them into a ritual that can transform? It might surprise you, but we welcome them. Now, why would we welcome them, you ask? Because receiving energy is far more helpful and far more sustainable than resisting energy. Because in welcoming these frustrations, in welcoming these situations, we reframe them as a friend rather than an enemy. When we encounter anxiety, fear, doubt, shame, or any other negative, and I put negative in quotes there, any other negative emotion or temptation, we can begin to welcome them as though they're dear friends who've come by to pay us a visit, simply to remind us that something in our heart needs attention. We welcome them to be teachers who help us see that we are only one small piece of a much larger whole, and that this person in front of me, the situation in front of me, whether it's another driver or whether it's my partner or my kids or a work confrontation, whatever this thing is that's in front of me, it's actually assisting me in doing my spiritual work and in its own unique way, walking me back home to God. Now, how do we practice this ritual of welcoming? I like to use an adapted version. I've adapted my own version. It's slightly shorter, changed the wording a little bit, but it's basically a version of Thomas Keating's, this beautiful Trappist monk. Father Thomas Keating died a few years ago. He wrote this thing called the Welcoming Prayer. And I hope that you find it useful. And I'd love to hear how you go with it. You can email me at phil@theinsidejob.com.au, and I want to hear how you're doing with it. Because why? We're all in this thing together. We really are. And I'm so grateful and so thankful that you're coming on this journey with me. And it's so much fun and it's so much joy to do this together. So, I'm going to read the welcoming prayer. It's good to take a deep breath before you say the welcoming prayer. Welcome, welcome. I welcome what has come my way because I know it's for my healing. I welcome thoughts, feelings, emotions, people, situations, and conditions. I let go of my desire for power and control. I let go of my desire for survival and security. I let go of my desire to change any situation, condition, person, or even myself. And I open to the love and the presence of God, His healing action, and His grace within. Peace and joy.